Do you often get hungry soon after eating? Do you feel tired and out of sorts throughout the day? If so, you may be experiencing glucose spikes. In Glucose Revolution, Jessie Inchauspé explores glucose's role as our body's primary energy source, while also examining the adverse consequences of too much glucose. She argues that glucose spikes are at the center of most common health issues and offers a collection of strategies for taking control of your health by stabilizing your glucose levels. Inchauspé is a biochemist and the creator of the popular Glucose Goddess Instagram account, where she first began sharing her strategies for stabilizing your glucose levels. She became interested in health science after breaking her back in an accident and struggling with numerous related health issues. After wearing a continuous glucose monitor and seeing the correlation between glucose spikes and her health struggles, she began studying and sharing information about glucose's effect on the body. In this guide, you'll learn the basics of where glucose comes from and how it works in the body. We'll also explore various diseases and conditions that can result from repeated glucose spikes over time, and we'll discuss Inchauspé's strategies for preventing these negative effects by stabilizing your glucose levels. Finally, we'll examine some alternative methods for managing glucose levels and take a closer look at some of the medical advancements Inchauspé references. New section: How glucose works in the body. According to Inchauspé, the molecule glucose is vital for our existence. It's our body's most important energy source, and we get it from the food we eat. Short form note: our whole body uses glucose for energy, but it's especially important to the brain. Our brains are extremely dense with nerve cells that consume half of the body's sugar energy. Cognitive functions such as memory, learning, and thinking depend on glucose levels and the efficiency of glucose uptake, so our brain suffers when our glucose levels are off. For instance, when too little glucose is available to the brain, it fails to produce neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that carry information between neurons. In this section, we'll discuss where we get our glucose and how it acts as an energy source in the body. We'll also define glucose spikes and explore why many modern diets damage our health by providing us with too much glucose at once. Where does glucose come from? As Inchauspé states, we need glucose to survive, but we can't synthesize it ourselves. This means that we must get it from another source: plants. All the glucose in food we eat came from a plant at some point. Short form note: the sugar we consume in our diets comes primarily from agricultural crops such as corn and sugarcane. However, plants aren't the only sugar producers. Scientists have created a new type of cyanobacteria that produces harvestable glucose, sucrose, and cellulose. The researchers hope to develop this microbe as a source of sugar for industrial products like ethanol and designer fuels. Currently, a lot of plant sugars are used to make industrial products, which pressures farmers to produce crops for non-food purposes. If scientists can make the microbe a reliable sugar source, it'll reduce the amount of energy and land that's used for non-food sugar crops, thus reducing pressure on farmers and the environment. Plants make glucose because they need it for energy just like we do, but they create it in a process called photosynthesis. They use the sun's energy to turn carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil into glucose. Could artificial photosynthesis be the future of energy? Researchers are attempting to create an artificial version of photosynthesis that can become a renewable, clean energy source to fuel cars and provide reliable electricity. Photosynthesis could be an answer to concerns about dwindling fossil fuels and resulting environmental destruction because it's arguably the most efficient energy system on the planet. To successfully mimic photosynthesis, a human-made energy conversion system must be capable of harvesting sunlight and splitting water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. To produce a useful fuel for humans, the process would also have to produce a liquid form of hydrogen. Scientists have achieved this in a lab, but the process isn't yet scalable for mass production. Glucose and other carbohydrates. Glucose is a carbohydrate which Inchauspé defines as molecules that are created when carbon and water join together, as happens, for example, during photosynthesis. Plants bind glucose molecules together in various ways and for different purposes, forming three main types of carbohydrates: starch, fiber, and sugars. Further defining carbohydrates. Starch and fiber are polysaccharides, or complex carbohydrates, meaning they're carbohydrates formed from multiple sugar molecules bonded together. Sugars, or simple carbohydrates, are either monosaccharides, single sugar molecules, like glucose and fructose, or disaccharides, two sugar molecules bonded together, like sucrose. The general chemical formula of carbohydrates is CxH2O(Y), with the X representing the number of carbon atoms and the Y representing the number of water molecules. For instance, the formula for glucose is C6H12O6 with 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. Starch. Inchauspé explains that starches are chains of glucose that plants use as energy stores when they don't have access to sunlight at night, and therefore can't photosynthesize to make more energy-giving glucose. Short form note. Studies suggest that plants are able to calculate and adjust their rate of starch consumption to ensure they have enough to feed themselves until dawn. At night, plants use about 95% of their starch storage. They do this by first assessing the amount of starch in storage and estimating how much time there is before dawn using special systems in their leaves. After their assessment, they divide the amount of starch by the length of time until sunrise, giving them an appropriate rate of starch uptake. During the day, plants make more glucose than they need, and with the help of enzymes, they join the excess glucose molecules into chains that form starch molecules. When a plant needs glucose again, it uses the enzyme alpha amylase to break some molecules free from the starch chain. In our diet, we get starch from foods like potatoes, oats, and barley. Short form note. Starches are made up of two different polysaccharides, amylose and amylopectin. They are 20 to 30% amylose molecules, which are long, linear chains of glucose. The remaining 70 to 80% is amylopectin, shorter molecules with a branched structure. Alpha amylase breaks apart amylose and amylopectin when plants need individual glucose molecules for energy. For humans, amylose and amylopectin serve an important culinary purpose beyond supplying glucose. When heated in water, they turn into a gel, making starchy vegetables like potatoes and grains like oats and barley effective thickeners in many recipes. Inchauspé notes that, like plants, our bodies use alpha amylase to break down starch into glucose. This process starts with the enzymes in our saliva and ends when glucose molecules are freed in our gut. Short form note. The type of alpha amylase in our mouths, also known as ptyalin, comes from the salivary glands. The alpha amylase that digests food into glucose in our small intestine comes from the pancreas. Fiber. Inchauspé states that fiber is also made from chains of glucose molecules, but the molecules are joined together in different ways than those in starches. Fiber is tough, holding plants together and keeping them upright. Because of fiber's strength, no enzymes in our bodies can break it down, so it retains its structure while moving through our digestive system. This means that it doesn't provide us with energy from glucose molecules. However, it does help keep our gut microbiome, the bacteria living in our digestive system, healthy. The importance of fiber. Though we can't break down fiber and turn it into glucose for energy, bacteria in the colon break it down through fermentation. The fiber fermentation process produces short-chain fatty acids, acids made up of just a few carbon atoms. Short-chain fatty acids play a huge role in the health of our gut because they promote the proliferation of good bacteria in our gut microbiome. Since a thriving microbiome is essential to overall health, eating enough fiber is a vital part of a healthy lifestyle. Additionally, the natural strength of plant fiber makes it useful for more than just our guts. It's also used as a material for textiles, rope, and other commercial products. Materials made of plant fibers are more sustainable than materials made of plastics, which derive from non-renewable fossil fuels. Plant fibers are also cheaper and easier to produce than plastics, and they're biodegradable. Common plant fibers used in commercial products include hemp, cotton, and jute. Sugar. Inchauspé defines glucose, fructose, and sucrose as sugars. They all taste sweet, but they serve different purposes for plants. Plants transform some glucose into fructose because fructose is sweeter. Fructose makes fruit sweet enough to attract animals, who then eat the fruit and spread the plant's seeds through their waste. Short form note: it's not only the sweetness of fructose that makes fruit an effective medium for spreading plant seeds. According to Stephen Gundry in the Plant Paradox, unlike glucose, fructose doesn't signal fullness to the body. Therefore, animals who eat fruit will keep eating more, increasing the chance that the plant's seeds will be spread. Sucrose, also known as table sugar, is also sweeter than glucose alone, and it's made when glucose and fructose combine. Sucrose is a slightly smaller molecule than glucose and fructose, allowing plants to store more energy using less space. Short form note: in addition to storing energy using space-efficient sucrose, plants compress glucose and fructose into sucrose so they can transport large amounts of energy more easily. Sucrose is dissolved in water within the plant and then moved through the phloem, vascular tissue designed to transport sugars in plants, into the stems and roots. Unlike in leaves, the plant cells in stems and roots don't have chloroplasts, which are organelles necessary for photosynthesis. Therefore, they rely on this internal transport system for energy. When we eat fruit and other sweet foods, our guts absorb their glucose and fructose, which then enter the bloodstream. Sucrose takes a less direct route into the bloodstream. Sucrose from sweet foods breaks down into glucose and fructose with the help of enzymes. Some of the fructose molecules from sucrose break down further into glucose, but the rest remain intact. Short form note: sucrose is made up of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. As Inchauspé states, some fructose is then converted into glucose that can be used for energy. Studies suggest that this conversion, which happens in the small intestine, also helps protect the liver from excessive fructose exposure, which can cause damage and disease. Too much fructose at once can overwhelm the natural buffering capacity of the small intestine and cause fructose toxicity. Where does glucose go? According to Inchauspé, once carbohydrates break down into glucose in our digestive system, glucose enters cells throughout the body. Organelles in our cells called mitochondria transform glucose into energy, which powers all body systems. Short form note: in the Plant Paradox, Stephen Gundry discusses how glucose isn't the only fuel for mitochondria. The fuel your mitochondria use depends on your circadian rhythms. During the day, mitochondria convert sugar into energy, but at night they use ketones to create energy. Ketones are a special kind of fat that's much easier to convert to energy than sugar. This means your mitochondria don't have to work as hard at night, giving them much-needed rest. That being said, if you're consistently eating too much sugar, as Inchauspé discusses, your mitochondria never get to rest, rendering this system less effective. Additionally, when our glucose levels increase, our pancreas releases insulin. Insulin is a hormone that helps glucose that's not being used for energy enter the liver, muscles, and fat for storage. The liver and muscles turn glucose into glycogen, a stored form of glucose that's broken down whenever the body needs a quick boost of energy. Short form note: Along with insulin, which decreases your blood glucose levels by storing glycogen, the pancreas releases another hormone to regulate your glucose levels called glucagon. Glucagon has the opposite effect of insulin. It raises your blood glucose up to healthy levels when it dips too low, such as during periods of exercise and fasting. It does this by prompting your liver to convert glycogen into usable glucose and release it back into the bloodstream. Glucagon also facilitates the production of glucose from sources in your body such as amino acids, and it prevents your liver from absorbing and reserving glucose. This storage system is one of the reasons we gain weight. When our diets have too much glucose in them, we overload our liver and muscles, and the only way the body can store that glucose is by adding on fat. Short form note. There are two main types of fat that result from excess glucose in the body: fatty acids and triglycerides. Fatty acids are fats directly converted from sugar. Their small size allows them to pass through the cell membranes of fat cells in your body, meaning that your body can burn them for fuel as needed. However, some fatty acids become triglycerides, which are composed of 3 fatty acids connected by a glycerol molecule. These larger molecules are formed inside your fat cells, and they're too big to pass through the cell membrane. As more triglycerides get stuck inside, our fat cells get larger and we gain weight. Additionally, whenever we eat foods containing fructose, we compound weight gain as fructose can only be stored as fat. Unlike glucose, we can't directly use fructose for energy. Short form note. Fructose's contribution to our body's fat storage isn't the only reason it makes us gain weight. Studies suggest that its effect on the area of our brain called the hypothalamus makes us more likely to overeat. One function of the hypothalamus is to regulate appetite, and fructose increases the production of neuropeptides, chemical messengers released by neurons, that stimulate hunger and decrease fullness indicators. What is a glucose spike? Inchauspé states that glucose spikes happen when the glucose concentration in our body suddenly increases and then dips after we eat. In the short term, glucose spikes can make us feel dizzy, nauseous, and exhausted. In addition, they can cause excess sweating, heart palpitations, stress, food cravings, and brain fog. Short form note. Eating carbohydrates isn't the only way you can cause a glucose spike and its accompanying unpleasant symptoms. Another culprit could be coffee. Some people's glucose levels are particularly sensitive to caffeine, so drinking coffee can lead to glucose spikes. Likewise, dehydration can lead to glucose spikes. With less water in your body, your glucose levels are more concentrated. Finally, your body can't use insulin as well when you don't get enough sleep. So poor sleep causes spikes by affecting your body's ability to store glucose. If you experience the symptoms of glucose spikes but don't think food is the cause, it might be worth assessing whether these other factors could be contributing. Glucose concentration is typically measured in milligrams of glucose per deciliter of blood. The concentration of glucose in our bodies shouldn't increase by more than 30 milligrams per deciliter after we eat. Anything above that is considered a glucose spike. Inchauspé argues that glucose levels are a good measure of our overall health because they affect every system in our body. Why current blood sugar tests may not be effective enough. Because glucose levels are important indicators of many health conditions, tests that measure glucose are a common part of regular doctor's visits. Your doctor will most likely want to test your glucose during your yearly exam if you're 45 years or older, you're overweight, you have a family history of diabetes, or you have heart disease, high blood pressure, or high cholesterol. Despite glucose spikes over 30 milligrams per deciliter specifically being an important contributor to many health issues, the tests that doctors most commonly use to determine your risk of glucose-related diseases, like insulin resistance and diabetes, don't measure glucose levels based on glucose spikes. Instead, they measure your fasting levels of glucose, the glucose concentration in your body when it's at its lowest, as in when you first wake up in the morning, or your hemoglobin A1C, your average glucose levels across 3 months. Some argue that these tests are too limited because for their results to be abnormal, your metabolism must have already sustained significant damage. Your peak blood sugar levels, about 1 hour after eating, are better indicators of underlying insulin resistance, which is a primary contributor to type 2 diabetes and other metabolic issues. Glucose spikes on a molecular level. The author argues that the more frequently we endure glucose spikes of 30 milligrams per deciliter or above after eating, the likelier we are to experience the following problems on a molecular level. Overloaded mitochondria and free radicals. Inchauspé states that when we experience a glucose spike, our mitochondria become overloaded. As we discussed earlier, mitochondria are responsible for turning glucose into energy in our cells. This system works well when the amount of glucose our mitochondria receive matches the amount of energy our body needs. However, mitochondria overloaded with too much glucose can't produce energy efficiently. Short form note. Recent research suggests that the harmful effects of high glucose levels on mitochondria may relate to glucose's role in decreasing the amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, in mitochondrial membranes. PUFAs perform various functions for mitochondria, including contributing flexibility to their membranes. In one study, experiments on mice found that excess glucose was used to form other types of fatty acids instead of PUFAs. These other fatty acids weren't as flexible as PUFAs, which put stress on the mitochondrial membranes and made them less efficient. Additionally, having overloaded mitochondria leads to the release of free radicals, which are small molecules that cause damage throughout the body. Short form note. Free radicals are dangerous molecules because they're missing an electron, which makes them unstable. Most molecules have an even number of electrons, but free radicals have an odd number. To even their number of electrons, they often take one from other molecules in your cells, causing damage to those cells. Oxidative stress. According to Inchauspé, our bodies can handle a certain number of free radicals, but repeated glucose spikes over time can produce so many that we enter a state called oxidative stress. Our mitochondria become less efficient, and we have less energy. Without the proper fuel, our organs can't function as effectively, and we struggle with frequent exhaustion. Short form note. The term oxidative stress derives from the fact that most free radicals contain oxygen. The chemical reactions that free radicals cause in the body with their odd number of electrons are called oxidation. Antioxidants, molecules that can offer an electron to a free radical and remain stable, are the body's solution for this. Damage to our cells and organs happens when there are more free radicals than the antioxidants in our body can handle. Antioxidants in your diet come from foods like berries, dark leafy greens, nuts, and fish. Glycation. Glycation is another process that frequent glucose spikes exacerbate. It happens when glucose molecules touch other molecules in the body. Glucose damages the other molecules and literally cooks and browns our insides. Once a molecule is glycated, it's damaged forever. This process is the main reason why we age and our organs decline, eventually leading to death. It's unavoidable, but the speed of the process can be increased or decreased. Glucose spikes speed glycation up since more free glucose molecules are administered to the body at once. Advanced glycation end products. Glycation damages the body when it forms advanced glycation end products, AGEs, which form when fat or protein combines with sugar in the bloodstream. AGEs are dangerous compounds. When they accumulate too quickly, the body can't get rid of them and they eventually lead to oxidative stress, inflammation, and various diseases. However, a healthy body can eliminate them with antioxidants and enzymes before they cause too much damage. Eating too much glucose can speed up glycation and lead to the buildup of AGEs, as Inchauspé states, But that's not the only way this happens. We also consume secondary AGEs in the cooked food we eat. Foods cooked with dry heat using methods like grilling, barbecuing, roasting, baking, toasting, and frying contain AGEs. When we consume too many, they accumulate faster than our bodies can eliminate them. Foods that are high in protein and fat and come from animals are more likely to contain high levels of AGEs from cooking. New section: Glucose spikes and health problems. In the last section, we covered the basics of where glucose comes from, how it works in the body, and how too much of it causes stress in the body on a molecular level. In this section, we'll examine how frequent glucose spikes and the corresponding effects of increased free radicals, oxidative stress, and glycation contribute to many acute and chronic health conditions, including the following. Type 2 diabetes. According to the author, type 2 diabetes is the condition that's most commonly associated with increased glucose levels. It results from the relationship between glucose and insulin. First, as previously noted, when we experience glucose spikes, the pancreas releases insulin to store away the excess glucose as glycogen in the liver, muscles, and fat. The more glucose there is, the more insulin is released, and the more glucose has to be stored as fat. Second, as the pancreas releases more and more insulin, our cells become resistant to the hormone. Because of this resistance, larger quantities of insulin are needed to store the same amount of glucose as glycogen. Eventually, the storage system fails. The body can't store glucose as glycogen anymore. With nowhere and no way to store glucose molecules, their concentration in our bodies increases permanently. Screening for and preventing type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a well-known disease because it's extremely prevalent. The CDC states that nearly half of U.S. adults have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. Still, it's estimated that over 80% of people with prediabetes and a quarter of people with diabetes aren't diagnosed. This is a serious problem as unchecked type 2 diabetes can have heavy consequences on the body. For example, persistently elevated glucose levels that arise when the body can't store glucose anymore, the condition known as hyperglycemia, can cause numerous other health issues such as vision loss, nerve damage, kidney disease, and slow wound healing. Many clinicians recommend being screened for diabetes if you're between 35 and 70 years old, especially if you're overweight. The earlier both prediabetes and type 2 diabetes are diagnosed, the easier they are to treat. You can also make changes to your lifestyle that help prevent type 2 diabetes and even reverse the effects of prediabetes. For example, some research indicates that coffee may help prevent type 2 diabetes by lessening the effects of insulin resistance. One study found that having an extra cup of coffee a day reduced the risk of diabetes in participants by 4% to 6%. Increased coffee consumption led to lower levels of markers that indicate inflammation and higher levels of anti-inflammatory markers. Specifically, coffee consumption increased levels of one anti-inflammatory marker called adiponectin, which helps make the body more sensitive to insulin, and lower glucose levels. However, if your glucose levels are particularly sensitive to caffeine, as we explored earlier, excessive coffee consumption may exacerbate your glucose-related health issues. Heart disease. Inchauspé states that elevated glucose levels and frequent glucose spikes can also lead to heart disease in the long term. This is because glucose spikes contribute to cholesterol accumulation beneath the lining of our blood vessels, which sets off heart disease. Short form note: in addition to damaging blood vessels by causing cholesterol accumulation, persistently high glucose levels damage the nerves that control the heart and blood vessels. This nerve damage further contributes to heart disease and increases your chance of having a stroke. People with high glucose levels from diabetes are almost twice as likely to experience heart disease or stroke. How do glucose spikes lead to cholesterol accumulation? The cells lining our blood vessels are highly susceptible to mitochondrial stress, which glucose spikes directly contribute to. When experiencing mitochondrial stress, the blood vessel lining's cells go from even to irregular in shape, making it easy for cholesterol to get caught in the grooves of the lining. Short form note: research has increasingly focused on the role of mitochondrial dysfunction in the development and progression of vascular diseases, diseases relating to the body's vessels, especially blood vessels, particularly atherosclerosis, or the buildup of fat on the inner walls of arteries. High glucose levels exacerbate oxidative stress and inflammation, two conditions linked to atherosclerosis. There's ongoing research into potential therapeutic interventions targeting mitochondrial damage and dysfunction for the treatment of vascular diseases, including treatments that suppress mitochondrial production of free radicals called reactive oxygen species. Additionally, when our glucose levels make our insulin levels too high, our liver begins producing a small type of cholesterol called LDL pattern B that gets stuck more easily on the edges of blood vessels than other types of cholesterol. High levels of glucose, fructose, and insulin contribute to the oxidization of LDL pattern B, making it even more likely to stick under the lining of our blood vessels. Finally, we experience heart disease when enough cholesterol accumulates to start hindering our blood flow. Short form note: cholesterol is a type of fat, and it must be connected to a protein to travel through the body. LDL cholesterol is a type of lipoprotein, a particle made of fat and protein. Specifically, it's a low-density lipoprotein, meaning it contains more fat than protein. LDL cholesterol delivers fat to the cells as needed. In contrast, HDL cholesterol, or high-density lipoproteins, brings cholesterol to the liver, which eliminates the cholesterol from the body. Though research supports Inchauspé's idea that the prevalence of small, sticky LDL pattern B cholesterol is connected to external factors such as glucose levels, there's also a genetic component to the size of our LDL cholesterol. Cancer. According to the author, glucose spikes can increase our risk of cancer in 3 ways. First, the increased number of free radicals that result from glucose spikes can increase our risk of dangerous DNA mutations. Studies suggest that this may be how cancer begins. Short form note: other factors beyond glucose spikes can lead to the proliferation of cancer-causing, DNA-altering free radicals, including tobacco smoke, UV radiation, environmental and occupational chemicals, air pollution, medical radiation, and certain viruses. Free radicals are most likely to cause cancer when they alter tumor suppressor genes that direct repairs of damaged DNA. Mutations in these genes are the primary reason cancer cells form. Additionally, high glucose levels lead to chronic inflammation, which encourages the rapid increase of cancer cells. Generally, inflammation is one way for the body to defend against harmful intruders, such as viruses and bacteria. However, the body attacks itself when it's chronically inflamed, leading to tissue and organ damage. Short form note: inflammation happens when the body responds to pathogens by producing chemicals in immune cells that kill the intruders. However, these chemicals can also alter DNA in healthy cells, which increases the likelihood of cancer-causing mutations. Symptoms of chronic inflammation may not be obvious at first, making it harder to prevent it from developing into more serious conditions. Typical indicators of chronic inflammation include muscle and joint discomfort, weight gain and unexplained weight loss, sleep disorders, skin problems, frequent infections, digestive problems, fever with an unknown cause, and mood disorders. Finally, high levels of insulin that result from elevated glucose levels make cancer spread faster, increasing the likelihood that we'll die from it. Short form note: increased insulin levels offer more opportunities for cancer cells to develop because insulin encourages cell production and decreases cell death. The more cells your body grows and the fewer that die, the more likely it is that some will develop into abnormal cancer cells. Specifically, research has linked high insulin levels with increased risk of colorectal, breast, and prostate cancers. Mental health issues and cognitive decline. Inchauspé also describes how glucose spikes can contribute to mental health struggles and cognitive decline. First, research suggests that people who eat diets that lead to frequent glucose spikes experience more mood disturbances and instances of depression than people whose diets result in more stable glucose levels. Short-form note: MRI data suggest that elevated glucose levels can lead to depression because they hinder connections in a part of the brain that regulates emotions and self-perception, which seriously affects people's moods. Additionally, consistently high glucose levels contribute to the dysregulation of glutamate, a neurotransmitter that's associated with bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. Second, glucose spikes can contribute to the development of cognitive diseases such as Alzheimer's. When the mitochondria and brain cells get overloaded with glucose after repeated glucose spikes, they go into oxidative stress. This then causes neuroinflammation, which can turn into cognitive decline as brain cells get damaged. Short-form note: the damaging effects of high glucose levels on the brain come from more than just mitochondrial stress. They also stem from the insulin resistance caused by consistently elevated glucose levels. Too much glucose means the body produces too much insulin, and over time, this can make it more difficult for insulin to enter the brain. Without enough insulin, the brain can't process enough glucose to power its numerous cognitive processes. Cells in the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain, are especially vulnerable to insulin deficits, which explains why glucose-related brain diseases like Alzheimer's involve loss of memory. Cravings and hunger. Finally, according to the author, glucose spikes can cause various issues related to our relationship with food, including food cravings and too frequent hunger. Food cravings typically happen during the crash following a glucose spike. Studies indicate that when our glucose levels drop, we crave high-calorie foods. For example, during a glucose crash, we're more likely to choose a slice of pizza over a salad. Short-form note: in addition to craving high-calorie foods, we also often crave high-carb foods when our blood sugar is low, such as during a glucose crash. We do so partly because they increase feel-good neurochemicals in our body like serotonin, which evens out our mood, and endorphins, which help us feel calm. Additionally, we may experience too frequent hunger when we have glucose spikes. This is because frequent glucose spikes lead to high insulin levels, and too much insulin can block the hormone leptin, which tells us when we're full. Then, ghrelin, the hormone that indicates hunger, becomes more active, pushing us to eat more. Thus, when our glucose levels are dysregulated, we get hungry as soon as 2 hours after eating. Short-form note: leptin is made in the fat cells and it regulates long-term weight control. Ghrelin is synthesized in the stomach and it has more to do with short-term appetite control. In addition to its role in regulating hunger, ghrelin increases fat storage, prompts the movement of food from the stomach to the intestines, and stimulates the release of growth hormones from the pituitary gland. Finally, ghrelin helps direct the release of insulin. Thus, when glucose spikes lead to overactive ghrelin, the way we store fat, gain weight, and digest food can all be disrupted and changed. New section: Strategies for stabilizing your glucose levels. Now that we've discussed some of the most dangerous and unpleasant effects of glucose spikes, we'll touch on some of Inchauspé's strategies for preventing them. In this final section, you'll learn methods for stabilizing your glucose levels, including how to eat and what to eat. How to eat to prevent glucose spikes. According to Inchauspé, the key to preventing glucose spikes isn't just in what you eat, it also matters how you eat your food. The following strategies can help you stabilize your glucose levels without requiring you to give up anything you like to eat. Strategy number 1. Eat fiber first. Inchauspé argues that you can dramatically reduce glucose spikes by simply changing the order in which you eat your food. Start your meal with fiber, then eat proteins and fats, and finish with starchy and sweet carbohydrates. Short form note: regulating glucose levels by changing the order in which you eat may help people who aren't able to change their diet by altering what they eat. There are many factors that influence our food choices, including socioeconomic class, religion, and family. If money is a barrier, for example, someone may be unable to afford to change their food choices, so being able to simply change the order of their meal makes this strategy accessible. Studies indicate that this eating order is as successful at preventing glucose spikes as diabetes medications targeted toward the same issue. Short form note: research supports the idea that eating in the order Inchauspé recommends can significantly reduce glucose spikes in diabetes patients. In one study, when patients with type 2 diabetes ate fiber and protein before carbohydrates, they showed a 29%, 37%, and 17% decrease in glucose levels at 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and 120 minutes after their meal, respectively. According to Inchauspé, you should eat fiber first because it prevents glucose from being absorbed into your bloodstream too quickly, thus preventing harmful spikes. Fiber accomplishes this in 3 ways. First, it slows the activity of the enzyme alpha amylase. As a result, your body breaks down starch into glucose more slowly. Short form note: researchers are trying to isolate the plant compounds and fibers that inhibit alpha amylase as a potential treatment for type 2 diabetes. Synthetic options for drugs that have the same effect have a lot of unwanted side effects, so natural compounds and fibers could be a better alternative. For example, one study examined grape pomace, a waste product of the wine industry, for its enzyme-inhibiting potential. Second, fiber reduces the speed at which your stomach contents empty into your intestines. Glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream through your intestines, so this slowing effect ensures that you won't get too much too quickly. Short form note: the slowing effect of fiber on digestion specifically comes from soluble fiber, or fiber that can dissolve in water. Soluble fiber draws water into the digestive tract and forms a gel, allowing for slower, more successful nutrient absorption. In contrast, insoluble fiber, fiber that doesn't dissolve in water, speeds up the digestive process and adds bulk to your stool. Both types are integral to a healthy diet. Finally, fiber creates a permeable barrier in your small intestine that makes it harder for glucose to pass through it into the bloodstream, preventing too many molecules from entering at once. Short form note: studies suggest that a lack of dietary fiber leads to the thinning of the intestinal lining, which makes your intestines more permeable. This has implications beyond quick glucose absorption. A too permeable gut lining can have negative effects on your immune health and leave your gut vulnerable to pathogens. Inchauspé suggests making a vegetable dish the first course of every meal so you never forget to start with fiber. Short form note: if creating vegetable dishes for every meal sounds intimidating, consider looking online for high-fiber recipes that can serve as starters. For example, NYT Cooking has a whole page devoted to high-fiber dishes, and the Mayo Clinic has a list of high-fiber recipes organized by category. Strategy number 2. Eat fats and proteins second. Inchauspé expands on her advice, stating that eating fats and proteins second further amplifies the beneficial effects of lowered glucose spikes. Fats and proteins also prevent the stomach from emptying too quickly, thus blocking rapid glucose absorption. You can still eat sweet foods and starches during your meal if you want, but they won't have such a negative effect if you eat them last. Short form note: in addition to slowing digestion, fats and proteins make us feel full for longer. Fats are the last macronutrient to leave our digestive tract, so they play an important role in making us feel satiated. Just like it's better to eat unprocessed carbs, it's best to eat whole, unprocessed fats like avocados, nut butter, and olive oil. Further, studies suggest that peptides, the digested versions of dietary proteins, block certain chemicals in nerve cells that make us want to eat more. By curbing our appetites, this prevents us from eating too much. If we've eaten proteins and fats before carbs, these feelings of fullness will make us less likely to overindulge in glucose-heavy foods. Alternatively, if you eat your starchy and sugary carbs first, they move swiftly to your small intestine, and there's nothing to slow their breakdown into glucose molecules. The glucose enters your bloodstream in a large, quick influx, causing a spike. Short form note: not all carbs enter your bloodstream at the same rate. The speed at which you digest and absorb a carb is called its glycemic response. Foods with high glycemic responses break down quickly, while foods with low glycemic responses enter the bloodstream slowly and steadily. Strategy number 3. Avoid eating carbs by themselves. Inchauspé acknowledges that it isn't always possible to eat the food types separately and in the right order. Sometimes you're in a rush and can't plan a balanced meal. Other times you might be eating a dish that contains all the food types at once, like soup. Short form note: if you want to create healthy, balanced meals that require low effort, you could try one-pot recipes that combine all your macronutrients, proteins, fats, fiber, and carbohydrates. Nutritionally well-rounded meals usually include a mix of protein, healthy fats, and complex carbohydrates. In these cases, Inchauspé suggests always accompanying carbs with one of the other food types to still prevent the quick absorption of glucose. For example, if you're having an apple, eat it with unsweetened peanut butter so the fat and protein help prevent a glucose spike from the sweet fruit. Short form note: some people practice food combining diets, meaning they believe certain types of food shouldn't be eaten together. This contrasts with Inchauspé's advice to always combine carbs with another food type. Proponents of food combining diets think eating the wrong combinations of food can lead to disease, poor digestion, and increased toxins in the body. For example, some believe that proteins and carbs should never be eaten together, and dairy products should only be consumed on an empty stomach. There's very little science to support these food combining beliefs, however, and most of them derive from ideas that are over 100 years old. In contrast, there's ample evidence to support Inchauspé's opposite claims. Strategy number 4. Exercise after eating. According to Inchauspé, you can also prevent glucose spikes by changing what you do after you eat, specifically by exercising. When you move your muscles during exercise, they use an energy-providing molecule called ATP to contract. ATP is made from glucose in the mitochondria, so you burn glucose every time you exercise. Instead of letting glucose collect throughout your body and cause a spike, your muscles use it up. The rate at which your body burns glucose depends on the type of activity you're doing. The more your muscles contract, the more glucose and energy they require. That being said, you don't have to do intense exercise to achieve these benefits. Even just taking a short walk after a meal can help. Different kinds of ATP. Some types of exercise are better for burning glucose because different kinds of ATP are made for physical activity of varying duration and intensity. Your body uses 4 different sources of ATP. A small amount of immediately available ATP is stored in your muscles, but this only lasts about 3 seconds. Once you've used up your ATP reserves, your muscles use a high-energy compound called creatine phosphate to rapidly synthesize ATP. This lasts for about 8 to 10 seconds, and it's good for short bursts of intense activity, like weightlifting. Your muscles can also use their reserves of glycogen, the stored form of glucose, to make ATP quickly. This form of ATP is made more slowly than the kind that comes from creatine phosphate, but it's still rapidly available and it lasts for around 90 seconds. This kind of energy is good for exercise like longer sprints. By using up your glucose stores, this also makes room for more reserved glucose from the food you eat, reducing your risk of spikes. Finally, after about 2 minutes of exercise, your body provides your muscles with oxygen, which means that aerobic respiration can happen. Aerobic respiration is the process by which glucose is turned directly into ATP with the help of oxygen. The glucose used may come from remaining glucose in the muscle cells, the liver's glycogen stores, glucose from food in the intestine, and fat reserves. This kind of ATP takes the longest to create, but it also lasts the longest. As long as there's a supply of glucose to fuel it, your body can make more ATP. It's good for longer forms of exercise like long-distance running, rowing, and so on. ATP made through aerobic respiration helps control glucose spikes after eating by burning glucose from many sources throughout your body. Walking, which Inchauspé suggests doing after eating, is a great example of aerobic exercise that can trigger this process. What you should eat to prevent glucose spikes. Here, we'll highlight 2 of Inchauspé's strategies for patterning your food choices in a way that prevents glucose spikes. Strategy number 1. Eat savory foods for breakfast. The author argues that we shouldn't eat sweet, carbohydrate-rich foods at breakfast because we're especially vulnerable to glucose spikes first thing in the morning. After sleeping and not eating for hours, the first thing we eat gets digested very quickly, so glucose from carbohydrate-rich foods is absorbed too rapidly. Then this causes glucose spikes that throw our glucose out of balance for the rest of the day. The easiest way to prevent glucose spikes at breakfast is to eat savory foods. Inchauspé suggests focusing on protein like eggs, then adding in some fiber and fat such as kale and cheese. Short form note. Some argue that eggs aren't a very healthy option for a savory, protein-rich breakfast because they contain too much cholesterol, which contributes to heart disease. However, studies suggest that eggs have a minimal negative effect on the body compared to other high cholesterol foods. Additionally, they provide essential nutrients such as vitamins B12, D, and A. Just watch that you don't eat eggs with too many other foods high in saturated fats, salt, and cholesterol, like cheese, bacon, and butter. For a healthier option, try eating just egg whites with fibrous greens, or try cooking eggs in olive oil instead of butter. The benefits of breakfast for diabetics and non-diabetics. According to recent studies, eating nothing for breakfast can be just as problematic for people with type 2 diabetes as breaking their fast with carbohydrate-rich foods. Researchers found that diabetics who ate nothing until lunchtime experienced large glucose spikes after all of their meals. Additionally, eating nothing for breakfast suppressed their body's response to insulin. Eating breakfast arguably has health benefits for everyone, not just diabetics. In addition to lessening the likelihood of glucose spikes throughout the day, breakfast foods that provoke a lower glycemic response make us feel more full. Therefore, they lessen the likelihood that we'll overeat at our other meals. One study specifically found that people who ate whole almonds with their breakfast, a food with a low glycemic response, felt sated longer and had smaller glucose fluctuations at breakfast and lunch. Strategy number 2. Drink diluted vinegar. Finally, Inchauspé states that drinking 1 tablespoon of vinegar diluted in a glass of water before eating something sweet can reduce a glucose spike significantly. Additionally, consuming 1 tablespoon daily can decrease your overall glucose levels. Short form note. You can use any kind of vinegar to experience the effects Inchauspé describes, but apple cider vinegar in particular has been studied for its glucose-stabilizing properties. Research suggests that apple cider vinegar can improve insulin sensitivity, which is one way it lowers glucose levels. Recommendations for a pre-meal dose range anywhere from a tablespoon, like Inchauspé suggests, to 2 tablespoons diluted in water. Apple cider vinegar is also thought to improve digestion, help fight infections, and reduce the risk of heart disease and cancer, but little research has been done to support these claims. These glucose-lowering effects come from the acetic acid in vinegar, which briefly inactivates alpha amylase. Without the enzyme doing its work, starch and sugars can't change into glucose as quickly, and we absorb glucose more slowly, preventing spikes. Short-form note. One study found that lemon juice also had an inhibiting effect on alpha amylase, reducing participants' glycemic response to bread, which is primarily starch. Lemon juice doesn't contain acetic acid, but it does contain a high concentration of citric acid. This suggests that generally, acidic foods that lower the pH of a meal may help slow the digestion of starch.